This is Captain Ross with 3B's Captain School, and this is an anchoring video in our deck video series. It's another video in our deck section. This video we're going to discuss anchoring. Our objectives for this video: we want to define common anchoring terms, state different types of anchors, state common anchoring equipment used to anchor small vessels, describe how to determine the scope or length of anchor line to use, describe the procedure for a dragging and fouled anchor, state factors to consider when selecting an anchorage. All right, so anchoring. Safe and effective anchoring is comprised of three basic elements. You want to have the proper equipment, the knowledge of that equipment and its uses, so the knowledge on the proper use of that equipment, and ability to select a good anchoring area. So let's go over the equipment first. First is the anchor. The anchor is a device designed to engage the bottom of a waterway and resist drag. Second term we'll use is ground tackle. That's a general term for the anchor, anchor rods, fittings, etc., used for securing a vessel at anchor. The rod is the line connecting an anchor with the vessel. We have the horizontal load. This is the horizontal force placed on an anchor by the connected vessel. So horizontal load is what's going to hold your boat in place when it's at anchor. And the vertical load is the lifting force placed on the bow of the vessel by its anchor rod. So the vertical load is going to help you weigh that anchor or retrieve the anchor. And then we have the scope. And the scope is the ratio of the length of the anchor rod or anchor line to the vertical distance from the gunnel to the bottom of the waterway that you're anchoring in. All right, so let's go over some types of anchors. So the type and size of anchor a boat uses depends on the size of the boat. Most boats should carry at least 2 anchors. The working anchor should be rated at least 6% of the vessel's displacement, and a heavy weather anchor 150 to 200% higher than the service anchor. So we want to make sure when we're selecting an anchor for a vessel that we have the right type of anchor for the areas that we're going to anchor in, and it's the right size. So here's some common anchor types. We have the Danforth, which is right here. The Delta anchor, which is right here. A plow anchor, which is this anchor down here with this little hinge. A Bruce or claw anchor. A spade anchor here. A mushroom, and a grapnel. So we can go over these real quick. Delta's excellent holding power on most bottoms. It struggles in rock. All anchors pretty much struggle in rock. The Danforth, it excellent in mud, sand. It stows pretty easily. Doesn't anchor as well if you have like a grassy bottom, those kind of things. But for general anchoring, especially along the East Coast, it's pretty good anchor. It anchors best in like a combination of clay mud. Then we have the spade anchor, and this one has the highest holding power. They're pretty expensive, but you know it's cheap if it works. If you're get a good anchor and it holds you and you can relax while you're at anchor, you know it's worth the money. We have the Bruce anchor, which is another anchor that's good in most conditions. The plow anchor, low holding power to weight ratio, so you're going to need a pretty heavy plow style anchor. And the mushroom anchor is good for permanent moorings because you have to get one super heavy, and you don't want to use those for everyday use because weighing that anchor and deploying it, you know, gets kind of cumbersome if it's a big heavy mushroom anchor, storing it too. And then the grapnel anchor, they say here it's good for river anchoring, but it's not appropriate for long-term anchoring. Like heavy grass, you could potentially use a grapnel. So those are our anchor types. Then we have the ground tackle, and that's made up of it's a term we use for the anchor, anchor rod, fittings, chains, swivel, and shackles. So here's a picture of a Danforth anchor. Here's some of the fittings that we may use to anchor off a cleat. We're going to hopefully go through a closed or open chock to prevent chafing on our anchor line. And then we have shackles here. We have a swivel and anchor chain connected to an anchor. So this is all part of our ground tackle. So selecting a good anchorage is critical to safe and effective anchoring. Generally, a combination of mud, clay holds the best, especially for that Danforth anchor. However, there are many factors involved in deciding where to anchor. The bottom characteristics, so what type of bottom, mud, clay, sand, rocky, shells, how much available space is there. You really got to take into consideration your swing circle. So you're going to anchor, and your anchor will be here at the middle, and then you're going to have to account for the anchor line that you have out, or the road, the length of your vessel, and be able to swing all the way around on the 360 as the tide and weather changes and you sit at anchor. The water depth for that whole swing circle, any obstructions, cables, wrecks, debris on the bottom, you want to really study the chart before you anchor and make sure that none of that's there. Protection from the wind and current, if you can get behind a little hook of land that has a higher profile to protect you from the wind, and then other vessels. The problem with really good anchorages is there's usually a bunch of other vessels there. But you take all those in consideration when deciding where to anchor. All right, so let's go over some procedures for safe anchoring. We want to select our anchorage, which we just went over how to do. We want to select our ground tackle. Normally you're going to be all set up before with your ground tackle, you're going to have selected it already. But if you have a couple different anchors, you have a heavy weather anchor and your normal anchor, you want to look at the weather and make sure you shouldn't be using the heavy weather anchor. This is all part of that selecting the ground tackle to use. You want to set up the ground tackle. So again, normally you have this set up and all rigged before you get underway. But if you don't, or if you're going to change the anchor you're going to use, you want to set up your ground tackle. Determine the scope. So how we're going to determine the scope of line, if it's calm, moderate weather, we're going to use a ratio of 5:1 to 7:1. So I'm going to take the water depth, the tidal range, and the freeboard on my boat. So if my bow is 5 foot above the water, I have 5 foot of freeboard, I'm going to add that. Say the water's 10 feet, so now I have 15 foot that I'm using for my water depth. And then I look at the tide, and if it has a 2 foot tidal range and I'm at high tide, then I just use the 15 foot. If it has a 2 foot tidal range and I'm at low tide, then I need to use 17 or add that 2 feet of tidal range to my calculation for the water depth. Once I get that water depth, then I'm going to multiply it by 5, 6, or 7 if I'm in calm water. And then once I put it out, if I don't feel like it's holding very well, you can always let more anchor line out. That 5:1 to 7:1 ratios for calm weather, and then 10:1 is what we want to use for heavy weather or a lot of current. So once we've got the scope determined, we've got the ground tackle set up, we're ready to go. We want to approach the anchorage slowly into the wind or current, and then once we're right on top of where we want to let the anchor go, we're going to let go anchor. And it's either us telling the person on the bow to let go the anchor, or if we're doing it ourselves, we're going to let go anchor. And then you can either let the current push you back slowly, which is what I like to do, or you can back down slowly. But you really want to go slow with this because you want that anchor to sit on the bottom and that anchor chain to lay across the bottom so that when you start pulling on it to set the anchor, you've got a really shallow angle. You want to have lots of horizontal load, so picture pulling it straight horizontally, not a lot of vertical load. So back down slowly or let the current push you back. Then once the anchor's set, you want to wait a few minutes, ensure it's holding. Set the anchor watch. So the anchor watch, you're going to use some geographical references on land, set up a range or something so you can kind of keep an eye on, make sure you're not dragging anchor. When you first let go of the anchor, you want to hit the save or man overboard button on your chart plotter so that when you set up your chart plotter's anchor alarm or your phone app anchor alarm, the center of your swing circle is where the anchor hit the bottom. Then when you're ready to weigh the anchor, you want to slowly move forward while retrieving the anchor line until you're at short stay. And short stay is where the bow of your boat is directly above the anchor. The line is straight up and down and pretty tight and snubbed off. Then once you're at short stay, you just wait a few minutes And any little bit of bounce, you'll start pulling those flukes out of the bottom and releasing that anchor. So let's go over some procedures that we can use if we're dragging anchor or if our anchor gets fouled. So first, if the anchor is dragging, and we determine this by our anchor alarm, ranges, the anchor line's bouncing, we can see it kind of bouncing across the bottom. First thing we want to do is increase the scope of the anchor line or chain, so let out more. And what that does is give you a better horizontal pull. You're not pulling from such a sharp angle, you're pulling from a lower angle. If that doesn't work, you can weigh the anchor and either anchor again in that same place or select a different anchorage. Remember, a combination of mud and clay works best for the Danforth. If you're in rocks and shells, you might have to do this over and over again until you find, a sandy spot or a mud spot on the bottom. It's not covered with shells. But the first line of defense against dragging anchor is to let out more anchor line. So let's say we're ready to weigh the anchor. We've got the anchor at short stay and we can't get it off the bottom. It won't budge. So you potentially have a fouled anchor. So the first thing you want to do when you have a fouled anchor is go back to your chart plotter and really study to make sure there's no cables, electrical cables, communication cables, anything anywhere in the area where you're anchored at. And once you make sure the bottom's definitely clear, second thing you want to do is make sure you're at short stay. So sometimes it can look like you're at short stay, but if you get up there and really try to pull that anchor line in or anchor chain in a little bit more, make sure it's straight up and down, get as much tension on it as you can. And then you can sit there for a couple minutes and see if it breaks free. Or you can slowly kind of maneuver around your anchor line, but be very, very careful doing this. If the water's deep and there's a lot of anchor line underneath you, or if you're not really at short stay, it's pretty easy to get that anchor line wrapped around your props. And then you have a whole host of other problems. So if you've done everything you can, you've moved around the boat, and you cannot get the anchor free, you may have to cut it free and mark it, come back later to retrieve it, or even hire someone else to retrieve it. But I wouldn't give it up on it too fast. I would sit there at short stay as long as I could. If it's really stuck in the bottom, sometimes it takes a little while for it to free itself, to come loose under that tension. This concludes our anchoring video and our deck video series. Please check our YouTube channel for other videos.